Welcome, one and all, to the latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal, and this is a Green Flame Press production. So, we are back with a new episode, a new and final episode in this series of episodes I've been doing on publishing process. And the idea was to do this sort of in the weeks leading up to the release of my debut novel, The Path of the Raw Wielder. Obviously, I have to throw this in if you're interested in pre-ordering it. It releases on the 28th, link in the description below. But the idea overall was I was going to do a few individual episodes on specific topics, some of which were suggested to me, some of which I thought of on my own. And this episode, the final one of the series, is going to be kind of a wrap-up. And I'm going to be giving my final thoughts on how this publishing process has gone for me, the lessons I've learned, and maybe some changes I might make for my next publication, which I'm aiming for doing in the spring. You get the idea. It's basically just an overview, and hopefully you can take a little something away from it. If you didn't catch the last episode on marketing and promotion, I will leave it linked in the pinned comment down below. And of course, if you like the video, please make sure you really hammer on that thumbs up button and subscribe to be notified of future content. I've done quite a few episodes of this publishing series, so if you haven't caught any of them, make sure to check out the backlist, and hopefully they can be of some help to you if you're an aspiring author. One quick programming note before we get started. I would wait till the end to say this, but let's be honest, not everyone's going to listen to the end. Although I'm sure 99% of you will, right? Normally I release these episodes every 2 weeks. There's going to be a small programming shift. There's going to be an extra week in between this episode and the next one. There's a few reasons for that. One of them being I've just got a lot on my plate right now with my publication of my first book, trying to get my second one ready to go, and then producing this podcast takes quite a few hours as well. So a little bit of an extra break there, but I'm also gearing up to do some NaNoWriMo content in October and sort of the build up to NaNoWriMo in November. And I want to really take my time and make sure I get that content right for you. So make sure you're subscribed if you're interested in that, and you'll be notified when it releases. Looks like I'm going to be releasing those episodes on October 15th and 29th. Okay, so I think that's enough of a rambling introduction to this episode for me. So let's dive right into the meat of the episode. Sit down, relax, and enjoy the show. I think we should probably start by discussing the fact that the publishing process is going to be a little bit different for everyone. And a lot of how it is for you is going to depend on your expectations going in. So what I would recommend, first off, for anybody who's going to undertake this process of publishing a book would be to try to set realistic expectations and goals. You know, I think that there are some people out there who think, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to get this book up for sale, and then a few days later I'll have sold so many of them that I'm going to go into work the next day and tell my boss to stick it, I don't need this job anymore. Now, I can't speak for everyone, but that certainly is not the case for me, and I don't think it's going to be the case for about 99.9% of us. Certainly it won't be the case for as many people who feel that that will be the case for them. So before you undertake this, do your research and try to get an idea for yourself about, for example, how well you can probably expect your book to sell, and things like this, just so you don't want to be disappointed. All right. Publishing a debut novel isn't likely to make you a millionaire. It isn't even likely to give you enough money to pay your rent for 1 month. That's just the simple fact of the matter. What it can do is serve as a building block for you to potentially have a very successful publishing career. It's the first step that you're taking. Think of it like this. Ultimately, the goal you're trying to get to, I would assume, if you're the type of person who's listening to this podcast, is that you would like to make a fulfilling and successful career out of your writing. So, how do we look at this? I look at it sort of as that goal is at the top. Say I'm on the first floor of a house, and that goal is the second floor of the house, and there's no staircase in between. So, each sort of action I take towards reaching that goal is just essentially building a step on a staircase that will hopefully eventually get me where I want to go. Now, releasing your first book is going to be, in all likelihood, one of your first steps, and in all likelihood, your most important step. But it's just one step. You're going to have to release more books. You're going to have to release a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. There's no telling how many it's going to take before you finally start seeing the return on your investment. It's going to be a little different for everyone. I can't sit here and tell you, well, if you just get to that fourth book, it's all going to be smooth sailing. I don't know that. Nobody knows that until they get there. The best thing that I can recommend doing is setting goals for yourself that are attainable, yet reasonable. Don't sit there thinking, oh, I'm going to end up on the New York Times bestseller list with my first release. That's extremely unlikely to happen. Maybe sit there instead and say, I'm going to establish a little bit of a loyal readership with this first book, even if it's, 10 readers. That might be more of a realistic goal to set for yourself. In keeping a little bit with this topic, I think it's important to discuss also being willing to reward yourself when you meet these goals. Being willing to acknowledge, you know what, this is a good thing. This is an accomplishment to be proud of. If I sell whatever this number of books is, say I have a goal to sell 20 books, okay. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a goal I set for myself, and it's meaningful, and it means something when I hit that goal. So I should be happy. I should be proud of myself. I should celebrate that. I mean, if it's only 20 books, maybe don't go out for a, 5-star dinner that's going to cost you $200 a plate. But maybe do some small, nice gesture for yourself. Maybe take a little day trip to a spot that you like nearby. Maybe buy yourself, how about this? Buy yourself a new book that you've been wanting for a while. These are the types of small sort of rewards you can give yourself that let you feel that pride, to let you know you really accomplished something that you were setting out to do. So set realistic goals and expectations, and when you meet those goals and expectations, be proud of yourself. Allow yourself to celebrate. No matter how small or insignificant it might seem in the moment, none of these achievements are insignificant. They're all just part of the building blocks, part of the staircase that you're building to ultimately get where you want to go. I think while we're on the topic of appreciating your accomplishments, I just wanted to talk for just one more minute about that. Just understand how huge of an accomplishment publishing a book is in the first place. Maybe when you get your first copy for yourself, just sit there and hold it for a minute and just think to yourself about all the work that went into this. Flip through the pages and realize, oh my God, there's so many pages and so many words, and understand, you're the creator of that. You're the one that brought this from the seedling of an idea to a whole finished product that you're now holding in your hands. It's a pretty cool feeling, and I think we tend to lose track of moments like these a little bit because we're in the midst of this process and it's so hectic, and you're marketing and you're trying to get people to buy your book and take a chance on you, and you don't appreciate those moments as much as you should. So appreciate the feeling of holding your own book and remember what that represents, all of the hard work, the dedication, the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it. I mentioned at the start of this episode that I have a lot on my plate right now, and it sort of makes me think about the next thing I want to talk about. And that's scheduling. When you're going through your first release, I highly recommend keeping a schedule. Maybe get like a daily planner. That's what I use. And make sure you're scheduling out the time for the things you want to accomplish. So I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm working on getting this first book released next week. I am writing another book in the series. I'm trying to get the second book in the series set for publication in the spring. I'm working on this podcast, and I work a full-time day job. So that's a lot on my plate. Now, without effective scheduling, it's really easy to allow a few of these things to fall to the side. And when you let this happen, it ends up creating more work for yourself later on. So what I do is I don't put my day job in my daily planner. I'm pretty well familiar with that and everything I need to do there. But I try to calculate about how much free time I'll have on any given day. And I try to structure that out with the projects that they fit the best into that period of time. So for example, today I'm working on this podcast, and this is pretty much my sole project, with the exception of I did a few updates on my website and I posted to my Instagram. Other than that, this day is pretty much dedicated to making this podcast because I understand how time consuming this is. Now, this last weekend was largely dedicated to the writing, the current work in progress that I'm working on. And later on in this week, I'm going to continue working on that. And I'm also going to work a little bit more on getting book number 2 all set up for publication. I've got to get my interior set so that my cover designer knows my dimensions. And I really need to get serious about my blurb and coming up with the title for that one. That one is stumping me, to be honest. So it can be hard to find time if you're juggling so many different things like this. And I'm sure most of you can relate. I'm sure at the very least most of you have a job, you might have kids, all sorts of things that require your attention. And so if you're not planning these things out in advance, it's easy to just sort of say to yourself, oh, I just don't have the time, or I'm too tired today, and let them fall off to the side. And you're going to hate yourself for that later when you have to play catch up. Just because you're releasing your first book and it's such a monumental event in your life doesn't mean the rest of your priorities and your obligations fall away. Or at least they shouldn't. So obviously this is a part where having a talent for multitasking really comes in handy. But you know what really helps you become better at multitasking is effective scheduling and effective planning of your time. So my advice, go buy a calendar or a daily planner and try it out for a week or two, just planning out your free time as closely as you can. Carve out the time for the different little projects that you have going on and stick to it. And I'm pretty sure what's going to happen is you're going to see more effective results the longer you do this. So from my point of view, if I hadn't stuck to such a good schedule while doing this, it's highly unlikely that I would have been able to get these podcasts out every 2 weeks. It's highly unlikely that I would be as far along as I am in my current work in progress or in getting my second book set up for publication. So it's just something to think about, but I think no matter how organized you are, we can always do better, and it's just something to consider. Try setting yourself a set schedule for your free time, or should I say the time you have to work on your writing-related endeavors, and stick to it. So we've been talking a little bit about the importance of scheduling. And there's one thing I want to add on to the end of this topic, and that's scheduling time for yourself. You know, it can be easy to fall into the habit of overworking yourself. I've fallen into this quite a bit myself, especially over these let's call it this whole last summer. So what's happened with me is my day job has been asking me to put in a lot of required overtime. And then on top of that, I'm trying to get all of these things that I mentioned before done. And so what happens is I tend to overschedule myself. Maybe I'm not getting enough sleep at night, or I'm never taking a day to just sit back and relax and, do something for myself, read a book, play a video game, something like that. And you can burn out really quickly keeping this kind of a schedule. So what I would recommend is maybe every 2 weeks, just schedule yourself an off day. Or even write in on the schedule something that you would like to do for fun or for relaxation. Something just for yourself to sort of recharge the batteries. You know yourself better than anyone, so you should know or have a pretty good idea of how often you're going to need this kind of a day. But they're really important. What happens if you end up getting burnout is you end up not liking what you're doing. And I don't think any of us want to feel that way about our writing, or at least I certainly don't. So don't underestimate the importance of a little bit of time off here and there. Don't get too excessive with it because you need to keep yourself working, you need to keep yourself ahead of schedule hopefully. But if you don't schedule that R&R time, you're inevitably going to burn out, and then you're going to end up putting your projects off. And then what's going to happen, you're going to fall behind schedule. And then you're going to have to work that much harder to get caught back up. It's a brutal cycle. So there's been a little break in recording. I'm recording this about 2 days after I recorded the previous part of the podcast. Took a little break because my voice was feeling a little sore, and while I was taking a break, I was reading through some articles and doing some research on the publishing industry. I came across an interesting article, and it made me think about something that I now want to bring up. And I'm glad I found this article because I probably wouldn't have even thought about this. This article was an opinion piece. I'm not going to link it, I'm not going to name it because I don't want to be responsible for this writer getting flamed or anything like that. Basically stating that authors and anyone who is a creator of a work of art should not be seeking payment for creation of that work of art, that the art itself should be its own reward. And this isn't the first time I've seen things like this written. And in fact, I've seen, it's funny, I've been on a few social media accounts of well-known authors, and inevitably there's usually a few people in the comments section that say something to the effect of, well, you've had such a successful career, why do you still have to charge your faithful readers for their books? And so you run into these people every now and then that think art is art and you shouldn't make any money off of art. Now, what I have to say next is my own personal opinion. I don't mean to offend anyone, although I might. These people are idiots. This is spoken. When somebody says this, it comes across as being spoken by somebody who's never invested a significant amount of time, of resources, of their own creative juices into creating something. Whether that be a book, a painting, a film, whatever type of art form we're talking about. You shouldn't be ashamed of wanting to make a living off of your art. When you write a book, you've worked very hard on that. I assume you did it because you enjoyed it. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to receive compensation in exchange for that. And I just wanted to address that a little bit because after I found this article, I ended up doing a little more research and finding this is actually a surprisingly common sentiment where, for whatever reason, people think they're just entitled to somebody else's work for free. If you decide to give your work away for free, that's your decision, but that should be your decision and nobody else's, and certainly not because anybody is telling you that that's the appropriate thing to do. So before we get to the rest of the podcast, I just wanted to bring that up because I've been shaking my head for the past hour diving down this internet rabbit hole instead of recording, which I should have been doing. So I just wanted to touch on that, and now I can close these windows, which I will, and we can get on to the next topic. One thing that has really stuck with me throughout this process is the importance of setting realistic publishing goals. So if you've followed me for a while, you might know my original plan was to publish back in May of this year, and that ended up not panning out. And the reason for that is because I underestimated how long the process was going to take, not just from my end, but you have to understand when you're publishing a book and say you're hiring an editor and a cover artist. These are people with schedules. These are people with a lot on their plates, just like you have a lot on your plate. And I would recommend making sure you leave more time than you think you're going to need. And try to avoid putting out a firm publishing date until you know for sure that you can actually make that publishing date. Another point I'd like to bring up is maybe consider writing a little bit ahead. So, from my point of view, right now, with my first book coming out next week, my second book is about 90% ready to go. I need to finalize the interior, my cover artist needs to finalize his end, and then it's ready to go. Now, I don't plan on releasing that book for at least 6 months, but working ahead like this gives you a lot of flexibility to release your books in a shorter span of time. And then after that, my third book is ready to go to the editor. I need to get that booked, actually. But you can see I'm in a position where I could potentially release 3 books in a very quick succession over the next year or so. But I've done that because of proper time management, proper expectations of my publishing windows, and also just working ahead. And it's really important when you're going through the process of publishing a book that you don't completely neglect your writing, because you're going to set yourself back quite a ways. That's where that schedule that we talked about earlier come in. Yes, dedicate yourself to getting your book ready for publication, marketing your book, but also be working on the next book at the very least. Think about how long it took you to get that first book done. Do you want to have to release that book and then put all of that time in before you have your second book ready to go? Probably not the best idea. The sooner you can get books out, the more you're going to stay in your readers' minds if you're putting out regular releases. If you take 2 years in between releases, this could be to your detriment. One of the more valuable lessons I learned has to do with first drafts. There's a lot of different advice out there about first drafts, and I think I'm going to do an episode on this in the future, just because there's so much information out there, and so much of it is conflicting. A lot of people will say, essentially, don't really worry about the first draft, just vomit out all the words on the page and worry about it later. There's another group of people that want their first draft to essentially be a nearly completed novel, almost ready for publication. I find both of these groups to be wrong for me. I tend to fall somewhere in the middle. With this first novel, I started writing this years ago, so I couldn't tell you exactly how long I spent on the first draft. I would estimate it to be probably a little over a year. Now, since then, I can write a first draft much, much faster, and that's because I took away some lessons from the first experience, and one of them is, it doesn't need to be perfect. I spent a lot of time trying to get that first draft perfect, and you know what? I still had a lot of work to do on my second, third, fourth, fifth drafts. My editor still had plenty of notes and plenty of things to correct when she got her hands on it. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that I don't care about the first draft anymore. I certainly don't subscribe to this notion that basically you want to tell the most bare bones story humanly possible in your first draft. I don't agree with that. That's not what works for me. To me, if you do that, I shouldn't say you because everyone's different. We're going to get into this in just a minute. For me, from my experience, if I do that, I tend to lose smaller details that I think of in my mind while I'm drafting the story for the first time. If I come back to it in the second draft and let's say I'm describing a room that two characters are having a conversation in, for example. When I first conceive the idea, I tend to have the clearest image in my head. So I try to get as many of those details down as possible so that I have them for reference later. Now, if I just went with the minimalist method and just put the bare bones of the conversation, says it's taking place in a room, I might lose those in the weeks and months in between the first and second draft. So no, I'm not trying to get a finished product on my first draft, but I'm also not trying to create a lot more work for myself later, and more importantly, I'm trying not to lose those small little details that come into your mind when you're first conceiving a story. I honestly think the best thing one can do when it comes to your first draft is find a happy medium in between the folks who say, just vomit out the minimum on the page and worry about it on your second and third drafts, or the folks who want to come out and basically have the finished version of their novel after the first draft. I think both of these groups of people are probably going to have a harder time than somebody who can straddle that middle effectively. The final lesson I want to touch on that I've learned throughout this process is one that I think would benefit everyone to hear. And it's quite simple. What works for one author is not necessarily going to work for another. You know, maybe you read, let's say, Stephen King's book on writing. It's a very popular book on craft, and it's a good book. I recommend everyone reads it. But at the same time, you have to realize that when Stephen King talks about his writing process and how he goes about writing books and crafting stories, that's what works for Stephen King. And I think we can all draw certain lessons from this, and we can play around with his method and find, what works for us. But if you try to follow him to a T, most likely you're not going to find a lot of success. I think it's going to be the same with pretty much any resource on writing, whether that be an author's book on the subject matter, a blog on the subject matter, even a podcast. Obviously, this podcast is the definitive resource. Just kidding. But just because something works for Stephen King, just because something works for me, whether that be craft related when actually crafting our stories, or a certain step of the publication process, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be right for you. And you need to understand there's going to be a certain amount of trial and error that comes your first time, and most likely your first few times. None of us is going to get this perfect right off the bat. None of us is ever going to write the perfect book or have the perfect release. But we're going to learn a little something every time. And we're going to learn about what works best for us, what our own process should be. So, welcome those difficulties that are going to come along with this process, because they're what's going to help you learn, they're what's going to help you grow. For me, the most important thing to remember when going through the publishing process is that yes, it's stressful, but you're doing this because you enjoy writing. You want to share this story that you've spent so much time on with the world, and ultimately, it's most likely going to be worth it for you. I can't guarantee you're going to have some massive audience, you're going to have a bestseller or anything like that, but I can guarantee you when your book comes out the day of, you're going to feel very accomplished. You're going to feel very good about what you've done. It's just something to keep in mind. Develop your own process, develop what works for you. And make sure you enjoy it and appreciate the setbacks and appreciate the difficulties. I promise, even if you can't see how, they are helping you grow. So with that, dear listeners, I think we're going to start bringing this podcast to a close. I hope you found, I know this wasn't necessarily an advice-driven episode, but I hope you found some of the content useful, or at least given you something to think about as you approach the publishing process for yourself. Another reminder, there's going to be a little bit more of a break. We'll be back on October, what day did I say? Yes, 15th. October 15th. Most likely with some NaNoWriMo related content. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, requests for that NaNoWriMo content, please feel free to reach out via my website, petebeal.com. I'm going to have that link down in the description below, as always. You can reach out with anything you want to talk to me about. Also looking for guests for future episodes, so if you are interested in appearing on this podcast, you can also do that via the website. If you enjoyed the content today, want to see more of it, please make sure you hit that red button in the bottom right corner. It'll subscribe you. And please hit that thumbs up button so I know you liked what you had to hear. Once again, I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you have a lovely day. Keep an eye out here on this YouTube channel over the next couple of weeks. I think I'm going to be throwing out a little bit of bonus content, not podcast episodes, just some little bonus videos if you're interested in checking them out. Until we talk again, please stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you very much.